Wayne's on the line, Republican. Wayne, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I'm a retired circuit judge from Birmingham, Alabama. I was not a personal friend of Senator Sessions, but I have to say this. I never saw him do anything that showed me that he was a racist. While he was Attorney General, there were many prosecutions of people who had violated the rights of blacks. And where this racism came from, I have no idea. I found him to be nothing but honorable, sincere, and really worked for the people that elected him. And I have nothing but the highest regard for Senator Sessions. And I think that when he says that he will be fair, especially like the recusing himself with any hearings against Hillary Clinton, I think that you can trust him because I found him to be that way in court. And
so you didn't know him personally, but you did have interactions with him as a judge yourself.
Yeah, yes, as a judge, and of course the Attorney General coming through the court all the time. And so I found him to be nothing, extremely honorable.
Well, thank you so much for calling and weighing in, especially since you had such close proximity. Wayne there calling from Birmingham, Alabama, and taking your calls while we watch the nominee for our Attorney General come back into the room. As soon as they start the testimony, we'll go ahead and end our calls, but just want to try to get one more here. Bruce calling from Warwick, Rhode Island, Independent. Taking your calls while we watch.
Hi.
And Bruce, sorry, we're going to have you turn down your TV there. We're going to go ahead and get started, though. Looks like things are getting underway for the next round of questioning.
Ask questions, and it doesn't matter how many it is. I'm going to stay here as long as people want to ask questions, because I haven't had my second round yet. And if I could ascertain that, I'd appreciate it. I know we have at least one or two Republicans that want to. Senator Whitehouse, you go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. Senator Sessions, welcome back. As you know, the Department of Justice has at its heart the career prosecutor and attorney corps that staffs it. On social media, conservative bloggers are already circulating names of career attorneys in the department who they say should be demoted or reassigned because of positions they argued under Attorneys General Holder and Lynch. One commentator for the Heritage Foundation has made the comparison to filth within the Department of Justice and suggested that, like the Aegean stables, you need to run rivers through the department and wash out the agency from top to bottom. And you yourself have criticized department attorneys for being secular. Now, that was as recently as November. Now, in Rhode Island, we have a long tradition back to Roger Williams of separating church and state. And as an attorney general and as a U.S. attorney, we also have a tradition of allowing career attorneys to follow the policy dictates of other administrations and not holding the career people responsible for that. I'm wondering how you react to this. Do you have a problem with career attorneys if their private religious beliefs are secular ones? And will you support the career attorneys against the pressure from these right-wing organizations seeking to wash them out like filth, to paraphrase the Heritage Foundation?
The Department of Justice is composed primarily of career professionals. As you know, Senator Whitehouse, you served there ably as United States Attorney, and I give them the highest respect. Most of those attorneys reach high standards, and they are willing to follow lawful orders and directions from their superiors, even if they might have a different philosophy. I do think it's often they're put into non-career spots and can go back to career spots, but I don't know how exactly that works. But so you would normally expect, and I'm sure the Obama administration made changes in the leadership of the department. They put career people in positions that they thought would be most advantageous for them to advance the causes they believed in. And that's sort of within the rules of the game, but to target people and to any way demean them if they were fine public servants and they were following the law and carrying out a legitimate policy of their supervisors would be wrong, and I think you should respect them.
Does a
I
secular
would do that.
Does a secular attorney have anything to fear from an Attorney General Sessions in the Department of Justice?
Well, no, and I use that word in the 90,000-foot level of a little concern I have that we as a nation, I believe, are reaching a level in which truth is not sufficiently respected, that the very ideal, the idea of truth is not believed to be real, and that all of life is just a matter of your perspective and my perspective, which I think is contrary to the American heritage. So that's just a kind of a criticism of mine. But we are not a theocracy. Nobody should be required to believe anything. I share Thomas Jefferson's words on the memorial over here. I swear eternal hostility over any domination of the mind of man. And I think we should respect people's views and not demand any kind of religious test for holding office.
And a secular person has just as good a claim to understanding the truth as a person who is religious, correct?
Well, I'm not sure. In what method? Is it less objectively committed to...
the methods that an attorney would bring to bear in
well, let me just say,
case.
We're going to treat anybody with different views fairly and objectively. And the ideal of truth and trying to achieve the right solution, to me, is an important goal of the American jurisprudential system, actually our legislative system. What is the right thing? What is true? And let's act on it and do the right thing. That's all
on the subject of what is truth, you may...
It's an age-old question.
You may be in a position as Attorney General to either enforce laws or bring actions that relate to the problem of carbon emissions and the changes that are taking place both physically and chemically in our atmosphere and oceans as a result of the flood of carbon emissions that we've had. It is the political position of the Republican Party in the Senate, as I have seen it, that this is not a problem, that we don't need to do anything about it, that the facts aren't real, and that we should all do nothing whatsoever. That's the Senate. You, as Attorney General of the United States, may be asked to make decisions for our nation that require a factual predicate that you determine as the basis for making your decision. In making a decision about the facts of climate change, to whom will you turn? Will you, for instance, trust the military, all of whose branches agree that climate change is a serious problem of real import for them? Will you trust our national laboratories, all of whom say the same? Will you trust our national science agencies? By the way, NASA is driving a rover around on the surface of Mars right now. So their scientists, I think, are pretty good. I don't think there is a single scientific society. I don't think there's a single accredited university. I don't think there's a single nation that denies this basic set of facts. And so if that situation is presented to you, and you have to make a decision based on the facts, what can give us any assurance that you will make those facts based on real facts and real science?
That's a good and fair question, and honesty and integrity in that process is required. And if the facts justify a position on one side or the other on a case, I would try to utilize those facts in an honest and appropriate way. I don't deny that we have global warming. In fact, the theory of it always struck me as plausible. and it's the question of how much is happening and what the reaction would be to it. So that's what I would hope we could see occur.
Indeed, I'll bet you dollars against those lovely Krispy Kreme donuts that we have out back that if you went down to the University of Alabama and if you talked to the people who fish out of Mobile, they'd already see the changes in the ocean. They'd be able to measure the pH changes, and they'd know that acidification is happening and that there's no actual dispute about that except in the politics of Washington, D.C.
Well, I recognize the great interest and time and you've committed to the issue, and I value your opinion.
I do come from an ocean state, and we do measure the rise in the sea level, and we measure the warming of Narragansett Bay, and we measure the change in pH. It's serious for us, Senator. Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you.
Now it looks like it'll be Senator from Texas. And Senator from Texas, I'm going to step out for a minute. When your 8 minutes are up, would you call on Senator Klobuchar?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sessions, I want to congratulate you on making it through a lengthy hearing and performing admirably. And I think your performance today has reassured this committee and even more importantly, has given comfort to the American people that you will be an Attorney General who will faithfully apply the law without partiality, without partisan lens, but with fidelity to the Constitution and the laws of the United States. I also want to do something I don't do very often, which is I want to commend the Democrats on this committee for, I think, showing admirable restraint. At the beginning of this hearing, I had concerns that it would turn ugly with accusations that don't belong in this hearing. And I think my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle have largely restrained from going down that road. I think that was the right decision to make, but I commend them for that. You know, I would note that in the recesses of the internet and in some of the groups that are speaking on this nomination, and indeed in the view of some of the protesters who have made their voices heard today, there have been racial charges raised, and indeed some of the protesters have chanted KKK. And you and I have both talked about this a number of times. That is one of the easiest charges for someone to make when they don't have an argument on the merits, when they don't have the facts behind them. And it is a particularly hurtful argument that can be directed at someone, particularly when it's countered by the facts. And what I want to focus on principally in this round is spending a little bit of time highlighting an aspect of your record, which is your involvement in the prosecution of Henry Hayes, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, because I suspect it is something that very few people watching this hearing have ever heard of. And it is striking and I think highly revealing. So I'd like to just walk through some of the facts. I know you're very familiar with them, but I suspect some of the folks at home watching this hearing may not be. In 1981, in Mobile, Alabama, the Ku Klux Klan ordered the murder of a random African-American man, Michael Duncan. KKK members Henry Hayes and James Tiger Knowles abducted 19-year-old African-American Michael Duncan. They beat him, they strangled him, they cut his throat, and they hung him from a tree. Absolutely shameful and disgraceful. You were U.S. Attorney at the time. Your office, along with the FBI, along with the local district attorney, investigated the murder. Department of Justice attorneys Barry Kowalski and Burt Glenn worked on the case. When asked about your work on this case, Mr. Glenn testified that, quote, during the entire course of the investigations, he, meaning Sessions, has provided unqualified support and cooperation to us, and independently as an individual who absolutely wanted to see that crime solved and prosecuted. Is that accurate, Senator Sessions?
I think it is, yes. That's exactly what I intended to do. It actually occurred before I became United States Attorney. Wrong group of people had been indicted in state court that complicated matters. The case was not making the kind of progress that it needed to make, and so we had a discussion. and we invited the Civil Rights Division attorneys, Burt Glenn and Barry Kowalski, both of which were exceptionally fine, and along with Assistant Thomas Figures in my office, broke that case, and I thought they deserve a great deal of credit. But I was with them. I was in the grand jury with them. I called the grand jury at their convenience whenever they wanted to come to the state, actually used and impaneled a special grand jury so they could be called when they desired it. It had already been called for another special purpose, but we added that to their purpose. And so they had the flexibility, and it was I thought, a brilliantly conducted investigation. I guess Barry Kowalski was the lead attorney in it.
Now, Bobby Eddy, who's the chief investigator for the Mobile County District Attorney's Office, he testified, quote, "Without his," meaning Sessions' cooperation, the state could not have proceeded against Henry Hayes on the capital murder charge. Chris Galanos, who's the Mobile County District Attorney in 1981, stated, quote, "We needed some horsepower, which the feds through Jeff Sessions provided. Specifically, we needed the investigative power of the FBI and the power of the federal grand jury. I reached out to him, Sessions, and he responded, quote, 'Tell me what you need and you'll have it.' And indeed, your office prosecuted Hayes' accomplice in federal court where he pleaded guilty. And Mr. Eddy testified that Tiger Knowles, the accomplice, pled guilty on a civil rights violation and received a life sentence, the highest sentence he could receive under federal law, in federal prison. And he continued to say Henry Hayes was tried in state court by Mr. Galanos' office and found guilty and sentenced to die in the electric chair. And this made Hayes the first white man executed in Alabama for murdering a black person since 1913. When you were the Attorney General of Alabama, you later argued to uphold Hayes' death penalty. And in 1997, 5 months after you joined this body as a senator, Hayes died in Alabama's electric chair. And I would note, not only that, not only did you assist in the prosecution of the face of evil, a Ku Klux Klan murderer who saw ultimate justice, but as it so happened, you also prosecuted Hayes' father, KKK Grand Titan Benny Jack Hayes, who ordered his son to kill an African American, and you prosecuted him for attempting to defraud his home insurer in order to collect money to pay for his son's legal defense. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And beyond that, your office cooperated with Morris Dees and the Southern Poverty Law Center to bring a civil suit against the KKK. And Mr. Galanos explained, quote, "After the criminal cases were over, the Southern Poverty Law Center took the evidence we had developed and gave to them, and they sued civilly and got a $7 million verdict on behalf of Ms. Donald. And the $7 million civil judgment against the KKK in Alabama bankrupted the Klan, leading to its demise in the state." Is that correct?
That's essentially correct, yes. In fact, they sold the Klan headquarters to help satisfy the judgment.
Well, I would say, Senator Sessions, it's easy for people reading things on the internet to believe whatever's raised, and passions get hot. And I know the protesters who stand up and chant KKK, they in all likelihood believe what they're saying because they're reading and being encouraged on the internet. But I have not seen any appointee to the cabinet, Democrat or Republican, who has a record like you do of prosecuting Klansmen, putting them on death row, bankrupting them and putting them out of business, and doing so as you had. I'll tell you, I admire your doing so, and I'll issue a challenge to our friends in the news media. I noticed every time a protester jumped up, all the photographers took pictures of the protesters. I suspect we're going to see them in all the papers. I would encourage the news media, cover this story. Tell the story on the 6 o'clock news about Jeff Sessions helping prosecute a Klansman who had murdered an innocent African-American man and putting him on death row and helping bankrupt the Klan in Alabama. That's a story that needs to be told. And Senator Sessions, I thank you for your record. I thank you for your service.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. And I would say it has been very disappointing and painful to have it suggested. I think the Klan was okay when we did everything possible to destroy and defeat and prosecute the Klan members who were involved in this crime. And it was a good joint effort. I was supportive of it every step of the way, and some great lawyers worked very hard on it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sessions, just this week, Backpage.com announced that it was taking down the adult services section of its website. Senator Cornyn and I led the bill on the Judiciary Committee. You contributed to it, which we appreciate. And then we also had work by Senator Portman and Senator McCaskill and Heitkamp and others on this issue. We had 48 arrests around the towns of New Ulm and Mankato, Minnesota alone, where Backpage was part of the operation. And so this was a good result. They took the fifth today in front of Homeland Security while you were testifying. But I wanted to know what your plans would be. The Justice Department finally came out with the National Strategy on Sex Trafficking, which was part of our bill. And so it will be in your hands if you are confirmed as Attorney General to implement. And could you just give me your thoughts on this issue?
Well, I'm glad that the entire nation seems to be giving priority to this. A lot of great people have given real focus to the problem of sex trafficking and the degradation and destruction that results from it. So I think it would be a firm and important part of the Department of Justice's priorities, and I would look forward to following up on the legislative successes and other things that are happening to see if we can make a real impact against this abominable practice.
I will say Attorney General Lynch and the Deputy Attorney General Yates, as former prosecutors like yourself, they've worked really hard in this area, so it would be worth talking to them about the work they've done as well. Antitrust, Senator Lee and I have long chaired that committee. We rotate depending on who's in charge of the Senate as ranking member. I care a lot about this. We're in the midst of a merger wave. Between 2010 and 2015, the number of mergers reported to the government increased over 50%. From 716 to 1,801. And over the last 18 months, we've seen substantial mergers in pharmaceutical, agriculture, cable, insurance, beer. Recently, across the political spectrum, there's been a lot of concern about concentration because, you need to have an even playing field if competition is going to flourish, and that means that's better for consumers if you have strong competition. Will you commit to making vigorous antitrust enforcement a priority? Kind of a sideline to that, there's some concern based on some of the statements from the President-elect that maybe certain companies or industries could be targeted depending on if they're in favor or not. These are not statements that you have made. Could you comment about independence of the Attorney General when it comes to considering these cases?
The antitrust policies of the United States have to be consistent and as clear as possible. As you know, that's not always as easy as some people might think. I could say with confidence that you and Senator Lee, as leaders, I believe, on the antitrust subcommittee, I know you are, have been more attuned to the details and the special issues that are involved in that section of the Department of Justice. So we would work resolutely on it. I have no hesitation to enforce antitrust law. I have no hesitation, if the finding justifies it, to say that certain mergers should not occur, and there will not be political influence in that process.
Thank you. I'm going to put a series of some other questions on the record. One is on synthetic drugs. We're working hard. Senator Grassley and I have long worked on this issue with Senator Feinstein and Senator Graham. And we have a new bill that we're working on to make it easier to go after synthetic drugs. And maybe on the record, we could get your comments on that. Drug courts, again, one of my top priorities. I think that they've worked very well in jurisdictions that are devoted to seeing themselves not just as businesses that want to see repeat customers, but getting people off of the treadmill of crime and drugs, and then a very Minnesota-focused issue. Minnesota was just got a designation called HIDA for high-intensity drug trafficking. A lot of it's based on the heroin and some of the opioid addictions that we've seen, and somehow it was set up so the money came through Wisconsin. If you know anything about the Vikings-Packers rivalry, this makes our sheriff's very concerned, and so I thought I would maybe just on the record again, I'm not going to get into detail, discuss this with you on the record and ask you some questions about making sure we get our due for the funding for Minnesota. But the last thing I want to talk about was just the refugee issue. We have the biggest Somali population in the country. Our U.S. Attorney and the Justice Department have done an excellent job in taking on some ISIS cases as well as al-Shabaab cases, dozens of cases that have been successfully prosecuted, and I know that work will continue. But what want that work to continue. We also have the vast majority of them are law-abiding, an important part of our community. And as you know, there has been a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric out there. I heard the story in Minneapolis of a family that went out to eat. They'd lived in our town forever. They had 2 little kids, and they go out to eat, and this guy walks by and looks at him and says, "You 4 go home. You go home to where you came from." And the little girl looks up at her mom and she says, "Mom, I don't want to go home. You said we could eat out tonight." And you think of the words of that innocent child. She only knows one home, and that's my state. She only knows one home, and that's America. So a big part of the job of the Attorney General to me is not just enforcing those laws as we have in our state against terrorist activities, but it is also protecting the innocents among us. So I wondered if you could close your questions from me by commenting about your view of how you would uphold all of our nation's laws, the basic value of religious freedom, but also the protection of people from larger crimes than the remark I just talked about, but actually bullying and those kinds of things, because I just think it has no place in our country.
Thank you. That is an important principle that you've touched on, which is the principle that in America you're free to exercise your religious beliefs as you deem fit, as long as it doesn't violate established law that would be important. So we have that provided for in the Constitution. We can establish a religion and we can't prohibit free exercise. And I believe, by and large, overwhelmingly, Americans value that principle and support it, and we should always hold it high, and we should not back away from it, and that includes Muslim friends and neighbors as well as any other religion. And you are right, overwhelmingly, there is not violence and radicalism among our Muslim friends and neighbors, and we should not ever think that and treat people in a discriminatory basis. When people apply to come to the country, it is appropriate, I believe, to vet them from countries that may have had a history of violence, to be careful about who we admit, because basically the admission process is a process that should serve the national interest. So that's sort of my view about it. I believe it's an acceptable and good view, and would try to carry that out. But the decision about admitting and not admitting is really not the Attorney General's decision at all. It is the State Department's, and it is the policy of the President and the State Department. And so we would just simply make sure if it's done in a proper fashion and not unlawfully.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I also have some statistics on immigration in response to some of the first exchanges that Senator Sessions and I had about what Minnesota, the business economic value of immigrants in our community. I'll just put that on the record later. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sessions, thanks to Senator Grassley and Senator McConnell, I now find myself as a member not only of this committee, but also the Intelligence Committee, for which I'm grateful. One reason why I thought it was so important for another member of the Senate Judiciary Committee to get on the Intelligence Committee is because while the Intelligence Committee conducts a lot of the oversight It's the Judiciary Committee that confers the authorities on our intelligence officials and law enforcement officials to do what they do. My hope is that during this process where we're coming off of a very contentious election, that our colleagues across the aisle will join us in making sure that the new president has his national security cabinet members at least confirmed on an expedited basis. And of course, I would include the Office of Attorney General as one of those. As you know, the Attorney General and the Department's National Security Division work with members of the intelligence community and help oversee the collection of foreign intelligence information. I know earlier Senator Leahy and perhaps Senator Lee asked you a little bit about the USA Freedom Act and the National Security Agency, but I want to highlight something you're well aware of, and that's the sunsetting of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. According to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which Congress appropriately appointed to oversee the activities of the intelligence community, Section 702, which will expire at the end of this year, has been responsible for disrupting more than 100 known terrorist plots, including the New York subway bomb plot in 2009 and other plots outside the United States. As I said, if we don't act by the end of the year, that authority will expire. I think we are fortunate on the Judiciary Committee to also have, in addition to our other colleagues, Senator Feinstein, who has until recently served as the ranking member on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and now, of course, she's ranking here. And I hope she, along with Chairman Grassley, will make sure that all of the committee members are thoroughly briefed and comfortable with the reauthorization of Section 702 and to make it one of our highest priorities this year. In addition to Section 702, as you know, there are other legal and policy challenges that you're going to face as the next Attorney General. Our national security investigators and law enforcement officers are facing incredible challenges, many of them technical challenges like growing encryption of communications, whether it's hardware or or software. We saw that being relevant to what happened in San Bernardino, where the FBI had to pay third parties a substantial amount of money to get at the communications contained in the telephones of the actors in the San Bernardino attacks, or in Garland, in my home state of Texas, where the last time the FBI director came before this committee said there were still a multitude of communications on the devices of the two shooters in Garland that they still had not been able to get access to. So the FBI director said this is a part of the tradecraft now of terrorists, and he referred to it as going dark. And thankfully, Chairman Grassley held a hearing on that just this last year. We know there are other statutes, including the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, things like the Electronic Communications, the so-called ECTR fix, which would allow the use of national security letters to get IP addresses, not content without a warrant, but IP addresses or metadata, which is important to these national security investigations. I think I know the answer to this, but as Attorney General, I just would like your verbal commitment here to continue to do what you have always done, and that's put the safety and security of the American people first. And you'll continue to work with us in a cooperative fashion to make sure that all the needs of all the stakeholders are being met, including the brave men and women who defend us each and every day in the intelligence and law enforcement community. Will you do that?
I will, Senator Cornyn, and thank you for your hard work and leadership on these important issues.
Let me ask you about the Freedom of Information Act. I don't know whether Senator Grassley had a chance to ask you about this or not. As you may know, Senator Grassley and I are, Leahy and I are kind of the odd couple on Freedom of Information Act reforms. As a conservative, I've always felt that the best antidote to abuse or waste is sunlight where possible. and you don't have to pass another law or another regulation where people change their behavior because they know people are watching. And Senator Leahy and I have worked closely together to see a number of reforms passed and signed into law, many of which I know you have supported and consulted with us on. It's not a blank slate. It's sometimes you have to be careful about disclosing information that ought not to be public information or is law enforcement sensitive or classified or the like. But I just would hope that you would continue to work with us, and I'm confident you will, but I'd just like to get your verbal commitment to continue to work with us to make sure that the public's right to know is protected. I'm not suggesting that the public has a right to know everything because, frankly, as I said, classified law enforcement sensitive information needs to be protected for important policy reasons. But will you continue to work with us to make sure that we protect the public's right to know to the extent feasible?
I will, Senator Cornyn, and I value your judgment and insight on it. It's an important issue, and I appreciate your work.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I move on to my questions, I'd like to respond very briefly to what Senator Cruz said earlier. It is important, in my view, that the members of this committee get clarity with regard to the nominee's record. That's our job, and it's important. Now, let's be clear. Senator Sessions said in his questionnaire that he, quote, personally handled 4 civil rights cases. Some of the lawyers who worked on those cases disputed that characterization, and Senator Sessions himself, after his questionnaire was in, felt a need to file a supplement in which he clarified that he merely provided, quote, assistance and guidance to Civil Rights Division attorneys on these 4 cases. Now, if that's a distinction without a difference, I'm not sure why Senator Sessions felt the need to clarify. But I want to move on. Senator Sessions, in late November, President-elect Trump tweeted, quote, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. Now, let's be clear. President-elect Trump lost the popular vote by more than 2.8 million votes. So what he's saying here is that more than 2.8 fraudulent votes were cast. Do you agree with President Trump that millions of fraudulent votes were cast in the presidential election?
Senator Franken, I don't know what the president-elect meant or was thinking when he made that comment or what facts he may have had to justify his statement. I would just say that every election needs to be managed closely, and we need to ensure that there's integrity in it. And I do believe we regularly have fraudulent activities occur during election cycles.
Well, the Department of Justice is tasked with protecting voting rights and prosecuting fraud. So if millions upon millions of fraudulent votes were cast, I would imagine that the next Attorney General would be quite concerned about that. Did the President-elect tell you anything about what caused him to come to this conclusion?
I have not talked to him about that in any depth, or particularly since the election.
Mm-hmm. So he didn't share any evidence of voter fraud with you, because I would imagine, as the man who wants that he wants to make responsible for combating fraud at the ballot box, that he would want to make sure that you had all the evidence necessary to take action and to protect the vote. So he didn't do that, evidently. Before we move on, I should note for the record that state election and law enforcement officials surveyed in mid-December found virtually no credible reports of fraud among the nearly 138 million votes that were cast, and no states reported indications of any widespread fraud. What's truly troubling about this, I believe, are these bogus claims of voter fraud, is what they're they're routinely used to justify voter suppression. And thanks to the Supreme Court's disastrously decided Shelby County decision, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, it is easier than ever before for states to make it harder for people to vote. Now, Senator Sessions, you have a complicated history with the Voting Rights Act. 10 years ago, when voting rights was a bipartisan issue, you voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. Everyone did. It passed 98-0. But you have also called the Voting Rights Act, quote, an intrusive piece of legislation. You have complained that the Act's pre-clearance requirement unfairly targeted certain states, and you have said that there is, quote, little present-day evidence that state and local officials restrict access to the franchise. You said that the Voting Rights Act has, quote, eliminated that discrimination. Well, Senator, after the Shelby County decision, which you celebrated, states began testing the limits of what they could do. And in many cases, citing the risk of so-called voter fraud as a justification for their actions. Now, that's what happened in North Carolina, for example. Just a few months after Shelby County, the state enacted one of the nation's strictest voter ID laws and enacted other restrictions. Without any evidence, the state described these changes as necessary to prevent fraud. Well, the courts disagreed. North Carolina's restrictions were challenged, and in July, the Fourth Circuit found the primary purpose of the restrictions wasn't to fight fraud, but to make it harder for black people to vote. Here's what the court said, and I quote, "The new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision. They constitute inapt remedies for the problems assertedly justifying them, and in fact impose cures for problems that did not exist." Senator, do you still believe that there is little present-day evidence of states restricting access to the franchise? And if you do, what do you think the Fourth Circuit got wrong when it found that North Carolina targeted black voters with almost surgical precision? Do you accept that North Carolina was targeting African American voters, but not believe that it was engaging in discriminatory conduct?
Well, you cannot create laws designed to inhibit the right of any class of citizens to vote. And so if the Fourth Circuit found that and there's a factual basis to support it, then any law that's passed would be subject to being either eliminated or altered. So I support your concern that laws of this kind cannot be used for that purpose. I do believe not long ago, the Supreme Court did uphold voter ID laws, but there are ways to do it and ways probably you cannot do it. So I am not familiar with the details of the North Carolina law, but you are correct. Any finding that's sustainable, that there's a racial animus in the passing of a law that would restrict voting, that law could be unsustainable.
Now, North Carolina is one of the states that would have been covered by pre-clearance, was it not?
North Carolina states would be, of course.
It would have been. So in other words,
I would just suggest that Section 2 allows all the remedies, and that's what I suppose they filed the action under in this case. It's just not a pre-clearance question, and that pre-clearance policy is intrusive, and as the Supreme Court has said, and I didn't mean that in any pejorative way. I was asked, do you believe it's intrusive? Is that correct? I said it is intrusive, but the Voting Rights, it said this in 1986, but the Voting Rights Act was absolutely essential to reverse the problems that we had in the South of systemic voting.
Chairman, let me just respond to that, please. Okay, here's the thing.
Well.
Okay, because we had this debate after Shelby, and Chairman Leahy tried to introduce something to substitute so that we could have pre-clearance again. which was fought by you. The whole point is that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, you're right. But how many years after North Carolina did that? So how many times, how many elections were conducted in North Carolina where African Americans' votes were suppressed? That's why you need pre-clearance. And as soon as Shelby came down, you saw Texas, you saw North Carolina go, oh, good. Now we can suppress votes. That is the reason you have pre-clearance. And that is the reason that you can't rely on the district court or the circuit courts to rule.
Mr. Chairman, I voted a few years ago for the Voting Rights Act extension for 25 years. It included pre-clearance in it. We all knew at that time that the Supreme Court would probably take up a case before long that would have wrestled with the question of whether there's a sufficient basis for the extraordinary remedy of requiring only a few states in the country to have every even ministerial act like moving a voting precinct to seek the permission of the Department of Justice first. The Supreme Court found that that no longer could be justified. The Supreme Court decided that we should not have, did not have to have pre-clearance. But Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act allows these kind of challenges that Senator Franken is talking about. That's what was brought in North Carolina. That's what's being litigated today. And the court there did, in fact, find that the voter ID law was improper, as I understand it. So I believe we proceeded in a lawful fashion, and I did feel in one sense that it was a good feeling that the Supreme Court had concluded there had been substantial improvement in our area of the country, the South of the country, in voting rights, sufficient that Section 5 could no longer be justified. But I voted for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. As Justice Ginsburg said, when an umbrella means you don't get wet when it's raining, and you don't take the umbrella away.
In the record, a letter that I just today received in support of Senator Sessions' nomination from the National Shooting Sports Foundation. Senator Sass.
Thank you.
Without objection, I should say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sessions, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Sarah Root case. I know that you and I have discussed it briefly last summer. Sarah Root was a woman who was killed a year ago this month in Omaha. She had just graduated from college, and she was killed by a drunken street racer. Omaha authorities believe that this guy had been engaged in similar activity many times in the past. He was an illegal immigrant. He ran into her car, killed her right after her graduation. He was detained by Omaha police. They ultimately notified the Department of Homeland Security. This guy is a flight risk. He was able to post a fairly insignificant bond, and he disappeared. The Department of Homeland Security did nothing to detain the guy, despite the fact that the Douglas County Sheriff and the Omaha Police Department asked that he be detained. The Obama administration determined that it wasn't an enforcement priority. I don't want to hold you to specifics on this case here, but I want to get your pledge in this context. I want to hear you talk generally about the coordination between state and local law enforcement on illegal immigration activities, and in particular in cases where serious crimes have been committed. But I wonder if you would pledge now that if I send you a letter the day after you're confirmed, would you give expeditious attention to responding with some of these details about how enforcement priorities are set inside the federal government?
Thank you, Senator Sass. I certainly will, and it does represent important failures that we're seeing too often in our system today.
Do you have any top-line thoughts on the way local and state officials interact with federal officials on immigration cases?
Well, the immigration enforcement procedures the courts have held are exclusively the power of the federal government. But it's also clear that a state official has the right to arrest somebody for the offense of crossing the border illegally. They have the right to arrest people who have entered the country illegally or repeatedly entered the country illegally for any kind of offense, including the offense of re-entering illegally. And the cooperative system should work in a way that the federal government then evaluates whether or not they want to put a hold on in order not to release that person until they can take them and see them be deported. And it's failing in a whole number of ways. You've got the sanctuary cities who refuse to tell Homeland Security that they've got somebody that's committed a serious crime so they can be deported. They refuse to honor detainers. On the other side, we've got Homeland Security too often having standards or failing to follow up on serious offenses of people who should be deported. So in both aspects, I think, Senator Sass, we can do much better. And if we, this country has every right to deport persons who are here unlawfully, who violate our criminal laws in some other aspect, and they should indeed be promptly deported.
Thank you. We'll follow up with a letter, because this guy, Edwin Mejia, who killed Sarah Root, it was obvious to everybody engaged locally, lots of law enforcement and the family whose daughter was killed, that this guy was a flight risk. And everyone was screaming to the feds, please don't let this guy disappear before he can stand trial. He's now on the top 10 most wanted list, and nobody thinks he's ever going to be found. Everybody believes he left the country, and this kind of case isn't an isolated case. It's a kind of handoff between federal and local law enforcement that could happen repeatedly if you don't have a federal government that has any clear policies. So I would like to send you a letter right after your confirmation asking for clarity about how enforcement discretion and enforcement actions are prioritized.
And Senator Sass, I would note that fundamentally that'll be a Homeland Security issue initially, and they need to set the standards of what they should and should not do. And I would think that General Kelly would be quite willing to also talk with you about it, as will I.
I will likely be addressing the letter to both you and General Kelly, so thank you. Completely different line of questioning. This morning, you were asked some hard and appropriate questions about the responsibility of a chief law enforcement officer for the federal government when you have, there are cases where there might be a conflict between your oath of office to the Constitution of limited government and a separation of executive and legislative authorities and the people that you report to when you work inside an administration. You said in the course of that answer that there could ultimately be cases where someone might have to resign because they were being forced to do something that conflicted with their oath. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit and talk about, the Justice Department's responsibilities and attorneys general past over the past few decades. Can you name instances where a resignation might be in order, and what kinds of lines would you envision being crossed, and ways that you as the Attorney General might push back on an administration if asked to do things that you regarded as inconsistent with your oath to the Constitution?
It'd be difficult to speculate on that. We saw that during the Nixon administration, but there could clearly be a circumstance in which there's such a relationship breach that an Attorney General wouldn't be an effective member of a president's administration. Maybe the chief executive could even be correct, and the Attorney General could be wrong. But if the Attorney General's duty is to give the best judgment that the Attorney General can give, and therefore, if it's rejected on a very fundamental area, then that causes great concern. Maybe in another area of less importance, you could afford to disagree. But I just think that that result should be very rare, has not happened very often in the history of this country. Actually, I can only know of one. And therefore, the reason is that usually the chief executives, and I would expect with President Trump, that when confronted or advised that certain policies are not acceptable, would accept that advice. I'm confident that he would. But you raise a hypothetical, and I've at least given you my thoughts about it.
Just to conclude, because I'm inside my last minute, but going back to the connection between this question and the OLC line of questioning that Senator Lee posed this morning, if a head of OLC, if the Assistant Attorney General from OLC was coming to you and saying, I've been asked to try to justify a certain position, I've been asked to write a memo to support this position, and I don't think we can get there. I don't think that the Department of Justice has considered wisdom and insight into the law is that we can ultimately write the memo that will authorize certain actions. How do you, as the Attorney General, envision that conversation going? Just tell us the parts between an OLC, an Attorney General's office, and the White House.
Well, Attorney General Mukasey, who I think is still here, yes, who I'm honored to have here today, he issued a memorandum about how the communications could be effectively carried out. And it restricted communications from the political officials to the Justice Department in a way that guaranteed integrity. But there's nothing wrong, as I understand it, through the proper chain of command, that a request for an OLC opinion on a certain subject. There's nothing wrong with the White House asking for that. Indeed, you want that. You don't want the White House acting. You want him to seek legal advice. And generally, historically, things get sort of worked out. If the OLC comes back and says, Mr. President, you can do this, but you can't do it this way. Maybe you can do it that way. Maybe it won't give you everything you want, but that's safe, that's legal, that's within the realm of action that the president can take. This, we believe, is not. And usually, in having an attorney general who has the confidence of the president, who the president knows was giving him the best advice, also advising him what he cannot do, which is part of good advice, is the way it's historically resulted. And you need the best lawyers, and you need to be very careful, because these things set precedents. They also can result in lawsuits and all kinds of controversy that should not happen as a result of a bad OLC opinion.
Thank you. The stewardship of the integrity of that office is critically important. Thank you for your forthrightness.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley. Senator Sessions.
Thank you, Senator Coons.
To return to an issue a number of senators asked about before, but I just want to get clarity about a particular concern I had. The intelligence community has issued a unanimous opinion with high confidence that at the highest levels, the Russian government engaged in an organized cyber attack that was designed to influence the American elections. And it is, as you've mentioned before, emblematic of the kinds of threats that the United States faces, whether it's China stealing our intellectual property or hacks into our federal database that affects a lot of federal workers, or in this case, a direct attack on democracy. And you mentioned in response to a previous question, you haven't been fully briefed on this. But there is a bipartisan bill that's been introduced to strengthen and sustain sanctions against Russia for this attack on our democracy. Is that something you'd support?
That is something that's appropriate for Congress and the chief executive to consider. In other words, how do you respond to what's believed to be a cyber attack from a major nation? It's difficult just to say, well, we're going to prosecute the head of the KGB or some group that's participated in it, no longer a KGB, of course. But so in many ways, the political response, the international foreign policy response, may be the only recourse. And it would help in that light that more clarity be established, which Senator Coons, you probably understand more than I, the discussions about having the world know that if you do X to us, you can expect we're going to do Y to you.
Well, I think this bipartisan bill is designed to be a forceful response, to provide predictable preemption of other countries that might believe that they could engage in a successful cyber attack to influence future elections, whether at the federal or local level. So I urge you to get briefed up on it, as all senators can now, and to have a clear public stance on it. Let me move to immigration, if I might. Alabama had a state statute that forced its schools to check students' immigration status before allowing them to enroll in school. Are you concerned at all that that statute might target innocent children and discourage school attendance for juveniles?
First, I had no involvement in that statute. Secondly, I believe the court struck that statute down. I'm not sure.
I believe that's correct.
Some of the act was declared improper and some not. So I don't, what was your question exactly?
Well, I'll follow up if I could. There was a statute in Alabama that was designed to require teachers, school administrators to check the immigration status of students before enrolling them. And I believe at that point 5 years ago, you made a public statement that we've allowed a sad situation for decades where large numbers of people are in this country illegally, and it's going to have unpleasant and unfortunate consequences. Some took that to mean that you felt that it was an unfortunate consequence, but appropriate, that children who were brought here illegally by their parents could be denied access to education.
Well, they cannot be denied access to education. The courts have decided that, as I understand it. The question is, could you even ask if you're lawfully in the country or not? And I don't know what the law is on that subject. But what I was getting at was that this is a continual problem and will continue to be a problem if we don't end the lawlessness. I mean, you'd rather have children, immigrant children, and children of immigrants here that came lawfully rather than unlawfully. It creates a problem that we don't need to have, and I believe is within our grasp to fix, and I believe people of goodwill will support that, and we need to get that done, and a lot of problems in our country and will be fixed, and a lot of our ability to create a more harmonious system in the future could become possible once this illegal system is fixed.
Well, as you know, Senator, on this committee together, many of us worked, put great effort into crafting a bill that ultimately passed the Senate by a strong bipartisan margin, would have invested heavily in securing the border and address a lot of unresolved issues in immigration. But my recollection was you did not support that bill. It's my hope that we can find a bill, as you say, that you could support. Let me move to another point. We worked together to restore funding to the Federal Public Defender Service when it was cut by sequestration, and I think that's because we both agreed that outcomes are more fair when there's effective representation on both sides. One of the amendments I offered to that immigration bill would have provided counsel to children who were applying for refugee status because they were fleeing violence in their home countries in U.S. immigration proceedings. Is that something you would support?
Senator Coons, excuse me, as I understand it, that is the law, that you cannot provide all lawyers to illegal entrance into the country, and I don't believe it makes distinguishes between minors and adults. But I may be wrong about that. I presume that's why you've offered legislation to that effect, to change established law. But in general, I do not believe we can afford, nor should we undertake, to provide free lawyers for everybody that enters the country unlawfully. I think that would be a massive. Children specifically, I understand that.
Specifically those who are applying for asylum.
Congress would need to decide what to do about.
Let me ask you another question, if I might. There was a lot of discussion in the course of the campaign. It was a very vigorous campaign about the role of immigrants and in particular Muslims in this country. And I just want to make sure I've understood this. You believe it's improper for the government to discriminate based solely on a person's religion, correct?
That's incorrect. I believe that religion as practiced by and understood by an individual could make that individual subject to being denied admission if that individual's practice of their religion would present a threat to the country. So we have no requirement to admit somebody who claims to be religious who would present a threat to the United States, and I strongly think we have every right to inquire into those kind of radical and dangerous ideas that some might possess.
So there's about 3 million Muslims in the United States today. There have been Muslims in America since its founding. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran. Would you support a national registry of Muslims? And what sort of surveillance of mosques do you think would be appropriate within the constraints of civil liberties and respect for free exercise?
I would not favor a registry of Muslims in the United States. No, I would not. And I think we should avoid surveillance of religious institutions unless there is a basis to believe that dangerous or threatening illegal activity could be carried on there. I'm not aware that there's a legal prohibition on that under current law.
Let me ask a last question, if I might. As Alabama's Attorney General, this is back in 1996, there was a conference planned at the University of Alabama, and this was for LGBT students. A conference to talk about a wide range of issues, from health to status in society for the LGBT community. And based on a state law, you sought to prevent that conference from happening. And a federal district court held that the existing state statute, Alabama state statute, that prevented gatherings in public buildings for the advocacy of sodomy and sexual misconduct, I'm quoting, the district court held that that clearly violated the First Amendment, the free speech rights of students to gather and talk about their lives. And you publicly announced that you intended to do everything you could to stop that conference, and I believe sought an injunction, which was later denied, and the 11th Circuit later held that this law was unconstitutional on its face. Would you think, looking back on this now, given your statement earlier that you understand the needs for justice of the LGBTQ community, that it was a poor use of state resources to defend a law that was so facially unconstitutional?
Senator Coons, that statute, the litigation started in another university before I became Attorney General. It was going on for about a year, and I believe the litigation arose from the group filing a declaratory judgment against the law, and as Attorney General, I felt I should attempt to defend the law, and the court ruled against it. And it would have been better we hadn't passed the law, and it would have been better the controversy hadn't occurred.
Before I go to Senator Crapo, I have a letter here from a former colleague, Senator Lieberman of Connecticut. And in that letter, he makes an important point, two sentences I'd like to repeat. Do I agree with everything he, meaning Senator Sessions, has ever said or done? Of course not. But I don't agree with everything anyone I know has ever said and done, including myself. If I were in the Senate today, I would vote aye on his nomination. I ask consent to put that in the record. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sessions, one issue that's been gone over a lot today, which I'm going to return to, is the question of the rule of law and whether you would honor it. Many times an administration will not agree with a particular statute, even though the language and intent of Congress are crystal clear. And in addition, many times the individual who has been appointed to enforce the laws doesn't personally agree with a law that's on the books. Yet as Attorney General, it will be your job, as you have already indicated, to enforce and defend the laws as written by the legislative branch, regardless of your own personal philosophical views. And I know that you've done this. Let me talk about a few examples. Even though you support the death penalty, you agreed to drop the death sentence of a defendant when you determined that the aggravating circumstances standard in the statute for applying the death penalty didn't apply to their particular convicted double murder. Even though you had supported a Republican governor when you were Alabama's Attorney General, when this governor violated the ethics laws, you agreed and argued to uphold his conviction. Again, when you were the Alabama Attorney General, you declined to prosecute a former Alabama insurance commissioner who was a Democrat, even though you received criticism for this. You didn't prosecute because you believed there wasn't actually a criminal violation. You also prosecuted the Alabama Republican Party vice chairman, even though you're from the same party. So it seems to me that your history shows that you can make those kinds of judgment calls and do what the job demands. I already know the answer to this question because I've seen it in your record and because I've known and worked with you for a number of years, but I ask anyway, again, if you're confirmed, will you commit to enforce and defend the laws and the Constitution of the United States, regardless of your personal and philosophical views on the matter?
I will, Senator Crapo, and I would note on the death penalty case, my appellate lawyers gave me a little briefing of the cases that were coming up, and they said, we'll be defending this death case, but we are probably going to lose. I said, why are we going to lose? And they said it didn't have the aggravating factor you needed to carry out a death penalty. And I said, we can't go before the Supreme Court and argue for a death penalty if it doesn't meet the standard for a death penalty, to which the lawyer said, well, the local people are really fired up about it, and we usually just do what they want and let the court decide. And I said, well, no, we shouldn't do that. Well, that turned out to be an easy decision to make that day. But when I was running for the United States Senate, maybe a year later, it became one of the biggest ads and biggest attacks on me that I had failed to defend the jury conviction for murder in this county. But you just have to do you have to do the right thing. And some of these other cases reflect the same thing. Indeed, this insurance commissioner, the case was taken by the governor's team to the state DA who prosecuted the case and convicted the man, but it was reversed on appeal by finding by the Court of Appeals that he didn't commit a crime, just like we had concluded originally. So these are tough calls. Sometimes I've not always made them right, but I do believe you have to put the law first, Senator Crapo, and I have tried to do that, tried to teach my people that, and none of us are perfect, but we should strive to get it right every time.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and I knew that answer, as I said, before I asked the question. But one of the other senators here today said that it's important to get your record out, and I think it is important to get your record correctly understood. And I think that there, unfortunately, is too much inaccurate reporting about your record. Another instance in that context, as you know, I am the Republican sponsor of the Violence Against Women Act that we passed recently here in the U.S. Senate and the Congress. You've been criticized for not supporting that act, but I want to give you a chance again to correct the record and to fully state the record. If I understand it right, you voted for the original and supported the reauthorization of that act at least twice, and your objection to the act that did pass this last time, the reauthorization, was not at all based on the question of whether to have the statute in place. It was instead based on an issue with regard to jurisdiction on tribal lands and other related matters. Could you again restate your position on the issue?
Well, thank you, Senator Crapo. And, you know, I came here as a lawyer, tried to conduct myself properly and consider what some might consider legal technicalities, but I think are pretty important. The bill, as I understood it, was controversial primarily because of this situation in which a non-tribal member could be tried in a tribal court, which apparently, I think it's fair to say, is not constructed in a way that's consistent with the Constitution, and that we have never done this before. And so 8 of the 9 Republicans on the Judiciary Committee concluded that this was not appropriate. So by voting against that version of the Violence Against Women's Act, if it had failed, we would not then, I'm confident, not had a bill. We would have been able to pass the Violence Against Women Act that didn't have that provision in it. So that's sort of where we were in the political process. And one of the bad things about modern American politics is if you take that position, you're not portrayed as being wrong on the tribal issue. You're portrayed as being against a bill that would protect women from violence. And I think that is unfair, and thank you for giving me the chance to respond.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that, and I can again confirm because, as I said, I am the Republican sponsor of that bill, And that description you have given is exactly of one of just a couple issues which were being seriously litigated, if you will, here, and which we were trying to resolve. And those of you who took that position, again, were not in any way objecting to the act. You had multiple times before supported it, and you were trying to help resolve one specific issue on the bill. And so I just want to clarify that with you, and again, get the record straight about where you stand on the issue. I see my time's pretty much gone, Mr. Chairman. I won't go to my next question.
I call on Senator Blumenthal. Out of consideration for you, I want to explain what I think we have left here, and if you need a break, tell me. We've got 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans to do a second round besides the chairman, but I'm going to wait until later to do my second round. We got 2 Democrats, I've been told, at least want a third round. And so what I would like to do is, first of all, if you need a break, we'll take a break whenever you say so now. And in the meantime, I'd like to have my colleagues take into consideration something I want to do. I want everybody to get over here that wants to ask questions, and I'm not going to take up anybody's time until everybody else is done, and then I want to take about maybe 15 or 20 minutes of your time to do the equivalent of a couple rounds with questions I haven't asked yet. So what's your desire?
I'm ready to go.
Okay. Senator.
I may take a break at some point, but...
Well, you just say when you want to take a break.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Sessions. I was pleased to hear you disavow and denounce Operation Rescue in response to my last question. I want to ask about a couple of other groups and individuals. In 2003, at an event called Restoration Weekend, you gave a speech praising a man named David Horowitz as a man, quote, a man I admire. David Horowitz has said, among other things, that, quote, all the major Muslim organizations in America are connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, and, quote, 80% of the mosques are filled with hate against Jews and Americans. He's also made a number of statements about African Americans, as in, quote, too many blacks are in prison because too many blacks commit crimes. You praised him as a man I admire. That statement was omitted from your response to the committee. Did you omit it because you were embarrassed about praising David Horowitz?
No, and I didn't know David Horowitz had made those comments. I read his brilliant book. What's the name of it? I have a hard time remembering. But it was his transformation, having grown up in a, as he described it, communist family. He was editor of Ramparts magazine, the Radical magazine, and I believe Radical Son was the name of his book. And it was a really powerful and moving story of how he moved from the unprincipled totalitarian radical left to a more traditional American person. He's written a number of other books that I've read, I think, one of them, but he's a most brilliant individual and has a remarkable story. I'm not aware of everything he's ever said or
Well, these statements have been reported publicly repeatedly over many years. You first came to know him in 2003. In fact, you received an award from the David Horowitz Freedom Center in 2014. You were unaware of any of the apparently racist comments that he made?
I'm not aware of those comments, and I don't believe David Horowitz is a racist or a person that wouldn't treat anyone improperly, at least to my knowledge.
Well, let me just
give me, the award he gave me was the Annie something Johnson Award, and that was the lady that went over Niagara Falls in a barrel. That's the award that I received.
Let me ask you about another group, which also you left out of your questionnaire, a group that the Southern Poverty Law Center, cited earlier by Senator Cruz, listed as a hate group, and you received from the Federation for Fair Immigration Reform an award known as the Franklin Society Award. The founder of that group has said, quote, "I've come to the point of view that for European American society and culture to persist requires a European American majority and a clear one at that." He said also, quote, "Too much diversity leads to divisiveness and conflict." The founder, John Tanton, also, through his Political Action Committee, contributed twice to your campaigns in 2008 and 2014, $1,000 in each donation. Will you denounce those statements and disavow that award and that support from that organization?
I don't accept that statement. I believe the United States should have an immigration policy that's fair and objective and gives people from all over the world the right to apply, and those who should give preference to people who have the ability to be prosperous and succeed in America and could improve their lives and improve the United States of America, and that's sort of my view of it. I do not accept that kind of language.
Will you return the award?
It's be contrary to my understanding of the American vision of life.
Will you return the award?
Well, I don't know that I have to. I don't know whether he had any involvement in, choosing the award or not, and presumably the award and the contributions that I did not even know, I don't recall ever knowing I got, are his decision, not mine.
This award, similarly, was left out of your response to the questionnaire. And I guess the question, Senator Sessions, is how can Americans have confidence that you're going to enforce anti-discrimination laws if you've accepted awards from these kinds of groups and associated with these kinds of individuals, and you won't return the awards?
Well, first of all, I don't know that I defer to the Southern Poverty Law Center as the final authority on who's a radical group. So I would first challenge that. They acknowledge publicly and have in the last few weeks that I was a strong assister to them in prosecuting the Klan, but they said they opposed me because their views on immigration. Well, I believe my views on immigration are correct, just, decent, and right. Somebody else can disagree, but that's what I think.
Would you also disavow support from Frank Gaffney at the Center for Security Policy, who gave you an award in August of 2015, similarly having made statements about Muslims and supporting your candidacy for Attorney General?
Well, they chose to give me the award. They didn't tell me what they gave it to me for, and I don't adopt everything that center would support. I don't suppose. I'm pretty independent about those things.
But
I
you
would
can
acknowledge
understand.
that Ronald Reagan, Dick Cheney, Joe Lieberman also have received that award from that institution.
Well, he hasn't been nominated to be Attorney General.
Well, he has not.
And
he ran for vice president on your party.
And the people of the United States might be forgiven for concluding that the kinds of attitudes and the zealousness or lack of it that you bring to enforcement of anti-discrimination laws might be reflected in your acceptance of awards from these organizations, your association with these kinds of individuals. So I'm giving you the opportunity to completely repudiate and return those awards.
Senator Blumenthal, I just feel like the reason I was pushing back is because I don't feel like it's right to judge me and require that I give back an award if I don't agree with every policy of an organization that gave the award. I was honored to be given awards. A lot of prominent people, I'm sure, have received awards at either one of these groups, And David Horowitz is a brilliant writer, and I think has contributed to the policy debate. Whether everything he said, I'm sure I don't agree with. Some of the language that you indicated does not, I'm not comfortable with, and I think it's all right to ask that question, but I just would believe it would be it wouldn't be proper for you to insist that I'm somehow disqualified for Attorney General because I accepted an award from that group.
Given that you did not disclose a number of those awards, are there any other awards from groups that have similar kinds of ideological negative views of immigrants or of African Americans or Muslims or others, including awards that you may have received from the Ku Klux Klan?
Well, I won't receive it from Henry Hayes, I'll tell you that. He no longer exists. So
Well,
no, I wouldn't take a Klan award from the Klan. So I would just say that I received hundreds of awards. I don't think I'm probably somehow should have made sure that the Annie Johnson jumping off the Niagara Falls, I should have reported that, probably. But so I would just say to you, I have no motive in denying or that I received those awards. It's probably publicly published when it happened, and I've received multiple hundreds of awards over my career, as I'm sure you have.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I apologize, and I'll return on the third round. Thank you.
I don't find any fault with the questions you're asking, except for this business that somebody that's in the United States Senate ought to remember what awards we get. I don't know about you, but I'll bet every other week somebody's coming into my office to give me some award. And you take these plaques or whatever they give you, and you don't even have a place to hang them. You store them someplace. I don't know whether even if I went down to that storage place and I could tell you all the awards I got. I don't need any more awards. It's kind of a problem that they give you the awards. And obviously, I'll bet Senator Sessions feels that way right now.
I don't differ with you, Mr. Chairman. I don't differ with you that sitting here, none of us on this side of the table could probably recall every single award we've ever received. But the questionnaire from this committee asked for the information as to all awards, and I think it's fair to observe that a number of these awards were omitted from the responses.
Okay, well, if somebody asked me to fill out that same questionnaire, it'd never be complete, and I don't know how you ever could make it complete. Before I go to you, I have a statement here from the Alabama State Senate, Quentin Ross, a Democrat, minority leader. He says, I know him, meaning Senator Sessions, personally, and all of my encounters with him have been for the greater good of Alabama. We've spoken about everything from civil rights to race relations, and we agree that as a Christian men of our hearts and minds are focused on doing right by all people. And I don't think we should forget that Senator Sessions got reelected to this United States Senate without a primary opponent or a general election opponent. Ye gods, you know, wouldn't we all like to do that? Senator Graham.
I've been unable to do that.
The record without objection.
Thank you. I had 6 primary opponents.
Yeah. Well, I can understand. I can understand why.
There you go. I'll probably have 10. I'll probably have 10 next time. But here's what I want them to know. I, too, received the Annie Taylor Award.
Annie Taylor Award.
Yeah, there it is. I was there. I got it, too. I don't get enough awards. You can speak for yourself. Yeah, I got the award. I went to the dinner, and Chris Matthews interviewed me. So I don't know what that means other than I'll do almost anything for a free dinner. You know, I like Senator Blumenthal, but, you know, we did this with Alito, this whole guilt by association stuff. You've been around 15 years. 20, well, 15 with me. I'm pretty sure you're not a closet bigot, and I got the same award you did. And who that other award was talking, who got it? Joe Lieberman?
He got the award at the Gaffney.
Okay, all right. Anyway, all I can tell you is that this whole idea that if you receive recognition from some group, you own everything they've ever done or said is probably not fair to any of us. And we can go through all of our records about donations. The bottom line is, Senator Sessions, there is no doubt in my mind that you're one of the most fair, decent, honest men I've ever met. And you know what I like most about you? If you're the only person in the room who believes it, you will stand up and say so. I have seen you speak out when you were the only guy that believed what you believed, and I admire the heck out of that. So if I get nominated by Trump, which I think will come when hell freezes over, I'm here to tell you I got the Annie Taylor Award too. So let's talk about the law of war. I think you were asked by Senator Feinstein about the indefinite detention. Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, this is Sandra Day O'Connor's quote. There's no bar to this nation's holding one of its own citizens as an enemy combatant. That case involved a U.S. citizen that was captured in Afghanistan and was held as an enemy combatant. Are you familiar with that case?
Generally, yes. Not as familiar as you, because I know you've studied
well, this is
great depth.
Well, I've been a military lawyer. This is sort of part of what I did. Do your constitutional rights as a U.S. citizen stop at the nation's shores, or do they follow you wherever you go?
Well, you have certain rights wherever you go.
So if you go to Paris, you don't give up your Fourth Amendment right against illegal search and seizure. Could the FBI break into your hotel room in Paris and basically search your room without a warrant?
I don't believe that.
No, they can't. Your constitutional rights attached to you. So the people who say, well, he was in Afghanistan, it doesn't matter. What the court is telling us, no American citizen has a constitutional right to join the enemy at a time of war. In Ray Curran, that case involved German saboteurs who landed in Long Island. Are you familiar with this?
I'm very familiar with that case. I have read it.
They were German saboteurs and had American citizen contacts in the United States. They were all seized by the FBI and tried by the military. So what I would tell Senator Feinstein and my other colleagues, the law is well settled here, that a United States citizen and other wars have been held as enemy combatants when the evidence suggests they collaborated with the enemy. Under the current law, if you're suspected of being an enemy combatant within a certain period of time, 60 days, I think, the government has to present you to a federal judge and prove by a preponderance of the evidence that you're a member of the organization they claim you to be a member of. Are you familiar with that, your habeas rights?
Correct, yes.
So, as to how long an enemy combatant can be held, traditionally under the law of war, people are taken off the battlefield until the war is over or they're no longer a danger. Does that make sense to you?
It does make sense, and that is my understanding of the traditional law of war.
And the law of war is designed to, win the war. The laws around the law of war are designed to deal with conflicts and to take people off the battlefield. You can kill or capture them, and there's no requirement like domestic criminal law at a certain point in time they have to be presented for trial, because the goal of the law of war is to protect the nation and make sure you win the war. So when you capture somebody who's been adjudicated a member of the enemy force, there is no concept in military law or the law of war that you have to release them at an arbitrary date, because that would make no sense. So all I'm saying is that I think you're on solid ground, and this idea of an American citizen being an enemy combatant is part of the history of the law of war. And I am very willing to work with my colleagues to make sure that indefinite detention is reasonably applied and that we can find due process rights that don't exist in traditional law of war, because this is a war without end. When do you think this war will be over? Do you think we'll know when it's over?
I've asked a number of witnesses in armed services about that, and it's pretty clear we're talking about decades before we have a complete alteration of this spasm in the Middle East that just seems to have legs and will continue for some time.
So
that's most likely what would happen.
You're about to embark on a very important job at an important time. And here's what my suggestion would be, that we work with the Congress to come up with a legal regime that recognizes that gathering intelligence is the most important activity in the law against radical Islam. The goal is to find out what they know. Do you agree with that?
That is a critical goal.
And I have found that under military law and military intelligence gathering, no manual I've ever read suggested that reading Miranda rights is the best way to gather information. As a matter of fact, I've been involved in this business for 33 years. And if a commander came to me as a JAG and said, we just captured somebody on the battlefield, you named the battlefield, they want their rights read to them, I would tell them they're not entitled to Miranda rights. They're entitled to Geneva Convention treatment. They're entitled to humane treatment. They're entitled to all the things that go with the Geneva Convention, because the court has ruled that enemy combatants are subject to Geneva Convention protections. So I just want to let you know, from my point of view, that we're at war. I'm encouraged to hear that the new Attorney General recognizes the difference between fighting a crime and fighting a war, and that the next time we capture bin Laden's son-in-law, if he's got any more, I hope we don't read him his Miranda rights in 2 weeks. I hope we keep him humanely as long as necessary to interrogate him to find out what the enemy may be up to. Does that make sense to you?
Well, it does. We didn't give Miranda warnings to German and Japanese prisoners we captured, and it's never been part of the rule. So they're being detained, and they're subject to being interrogated properly and lawfully anytime, any day, and they're not entitled to a lawyer and
right.
And so forth.
Miranda and all didn't exist back in World War II, but it does now. But that the law, the Hamdi cases, this is very important, that you do not have to read an enemy combatant the Miranda rights. They do have a right to counsel in a habeas proceeding.
In a habeas course, you're correct.
See if the government got it right. You can hold them as long as it's necessary for intelligence gathering, and you can try them in Article III courts. You can try them in military commissions. As Attorney General of the United States, would you accept that military commissions could be the proper venue under certain circumstances for terrorists?
Yes.
Thank you.
Senator Ronald, and then Senator Kennedy, and then you should take a break, because I want one. Okay. Proceed.
Thank you. Senator Sessions, in 1944, the Supreme Court handed down what is considered one of the worst rulings in the history of our country, and that case is Korematsu versus United States, which upheld the constitutionality of the internment of Japanese Americans in internment camps. Despite the near universal condemnation today of the court's ruling, this past November, Carl Higbie, a spokesman for a pro-Trump super PAC and a surrogate for President-elect Trump, cited Korematsu as precedent for a program which would require Muslims in the United States to register with the government. Here are my questions. First, would you support such a registry for Muslim Americans? In other words, U.S. citizens.
I do not believe we need a registration program for U.S. citizens who happen to be Muslim. Is that the question?
Yes, my question is whether you would support such a registry for U.S. citizens who happen to be Muslims.
No.
Thank you. So since the president may go in that direction, what kind of constitutional problems would there be for U.S. citizens who happen to be Muslims to be required to register?
Well, my understanding is, as I recall, the later comments by President-elect Trump do not advocate for that registration. But he will have to speak for himself on his policies, but I don't think that's accurate at this point as his last stated position on it.
Since you don't support such a registry for U.S. citizen Muslims, Is that because you think that there are some constitutional issues involved with such a requirement for U.S. citizen Muslims?
It would raise serious constitutional problems because the Constitution explicitly guarantees the right to free exercise of religion. And I believe Americans overwhelmingly honor that and should continue to honor it. And it would include Muslims for sure. And I don't believe they should be treated differently, fundamentally. Should not be treated differently.
In addition to the freedom of religion provisions, perhaps there would be some equal protection constitutional problems, possibly some procedural due process constitutional problems with that kind of registry requirement. Turning to consent decrees, there are more than 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. America's police officers are the best in the world, and that is due in large part to their bravery, skill, and integrity in what they do. Our Constitution ensures that the government is responsible to its citizens and that certain rights should not be violated by the government. But that does not mean that things always work perfectly, as you noted in one of your responses in the real world. So while the vast majority of police officers do exemplary work and build strong relationships with their communities to keep the public safe, there have been specific use of force, deadly incidents that have sparked nationwide outrage. Some of these incidents have led the Attorney General's Civil Rights Division to do investigations into whether individual police departments have a quote-unquote pattern of practice, unquote, of unconstitutional policing, and to make sure police departments are compliant with the law. And when these investigations find that police departments are engaged in unconstitutional policing, they are frequently resolved through consent decrees with the Department of Justice, which requires police departments to undertake certain important reforms that are overseen by independent monitors to ensure that necessary changes are being made in these departments. Senator Sessions, you once wrote that, and I quote, "Consent decrees have a profound effect on our legal system as they constitute an end run around the democratic processes," end quote. Currently, more than 20 police departments around the country are engaged in consent decrees with the Justice Department. In Maryland, Baltimore Mayor Catherine Pugh said Monday she expects her city to finalize a consent decree with the Justice Department this week, as noted in the Baltimore Sun. My question is, will you commit to maintaining and enforcing the consent decrees that the Justice Department has negotiated during this administration?
Those decrees remain in force until and if they're changed, and they would be enforced. The consent decree itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a legitimate decision. There can be circumstances in which police departments are subject to a lawsuit, which is what starts this process, ultimately ending in a consent decree. But I think there's concern that good police officers and good departments can be sued by the Department of Justice when you just have individuals within a department who have done wrong, and those individuals need to be prosecuted. And these lawsuits undermine the respect for police officers and create an impression that the entire department is not doing their work consistent with fidelity to law and fairness, and we need to be careful before we do that. That's what I would say to you, because of filing a lawsuit against a police department has ramifications sometimes beyond what a lot of people think, and it can impact morale of the officers. It can impact and affect the view of citizens to their police department. And I just think that caution is always required in these cases.
Senator
I wouldn't
Sessions,
prejudge a specific case.
I understand that, but showing of a pattern of practice needs to be shown. So these are not just a rogue police officer doing something that would be deemed unconstitutional. So are you saying that with regard to negotiated consent decrees that you will revisit these consent decrees and perhaps give police departments a second bite at the apple so that they can undo some of the requirements on them?
Well, presumably the Department of Justice under the Holder-Lynch leadership always would be expecting to end these decrees at some point. So I just wouldn't commit that there would never be any changes in them. And if departments have complied or reached other developments that could justify the withdrawal or modification of a consent decree, of course I would do that.
Well, usually consent decrees require when they end, it's because they have complied with the provisions of the consent decree. So I'm just trying to get a simple answer.
Well, I'll give you a simple answer. It's a difficult thing for a city to be sued by the Department of Justice and to be told that your police department is systematically failing to serve the people of the state or the city. And so that's an august responsibility of the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. And so they often feel forced to agree to a consent decree just to remove that stigma. And sometimes there are difficulties there. So I just think we need to be careful and respectful
I
of
understand that. But as to the consent decrees that were negotiated with both parties in full, faith to do what's appropriate, that you would leave those intact unless there are some exigent or some extraordinary circumstances. Of course, going forward as Attorney General, you can enter into whatever consent decrees you deem appropriately appropriate. So my question really is the existing consent decrees, which took a lot to negotiate, by the way. And it's not the vast majority of police departments in this country. It's 20.
You can answer that if you want to, and then we'll move on.
I understand what you're saying, and one of the impacts of a consent decree is it does require judicial approval of any alteration in it, and it that raises pros and cons.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, could you tell the committee a little bit more about what it was like to be a U.S. attorney? What was your management style? Did you enjoy it? How was it compared to serving in the state government as a state attorney general?
I love being a U.S. attorney. That was, I hate to say it, we all said, almost everybody that's held a job says it's the greatest job. If you like law enforcement and trying to protect citizens and prosecuting criminals. It was just a fabulous job, and we had great assistants, and I loved it, and our team did. It was Camelot days for me, and so I did feel that. I only had 2 years as Attorney General. We had this monumental deficit when I got elected, and we had to lay off a third of the office because we didn't have money to pay the electric bill. And it was just one thing after another, and then I was running for the Senate. So I didn't get to enjoy that job, but the United States Attorney's job was a really fabulous experience. And I believe in the course of it, I worked with FBI, DEA, U.S. Customs, Marshal Service, all the federal agencies, ATF, IRS, Postal Service, and their inspectors, and you get to know their cultures and their crimes that they investigate, the officers and what motivates them, and how a little praise and affirmation is so important for them. They get the same salary, you know. If they're not being appreciated, they feel demeaned, their morale can decline. So that kind of experience was wonderful, and I do think it would help me be a better Attorney General.
I've made up my mind. I yield back my time. I hope you will be a raging voice of common sense at the Department of Justice, Senator.
Well, thank you.
Before you take a break, I hope that all the people that still want to do a third round will come back in about maybe 15 minutes or a little less. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, we stand in recess for 15 minutes or so.
John Kemp. Oh, thank you.
Oh, dear.